My son-in-law had no idea I owned the company he works for as CEO. He always saw me living simply a quiet old man in a faded corduroy jacket who kept to himself. One evening, he invited me to a private dinner with his wealthy parents. I accepted the invitation, wanting to see exactly how they would treat a poor man. They showed their true colors the moment they slid a thick white envelope across the walnut table, offering to buy my absence from my own daughter's life. 5 minutes later, the foundation of their entire world began to collapse. A bitter Detroit wind knifed through the thin fabric of that old corduroy jacket as I planted myself on the sidewalk in front of the most exclusive steakhouse in the city. Valets in pressed uniforms darted around me, swinging open doors for men stepping out of European sports car suits on their backs worth more than a solid used vehicle. I dropped my gaze to my worn work boots, spotless buffed with real attention, yet bearing every mark of long, hard years. I had owned these boots for 15 years. One phone call was all it would have taken to buy that entire restaurant outright, but I pulled on the boots anyway. I put on the faded jacket anyway. That was exactly the point. Welcome to Honor Revenge Stories, where the people who were written off have a way of getting the last word. If these stories speak to you, tap subscribe so the next one finds its way to you. I would hate for you to miss what is coming. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something from what you have heard so far. Who are you already rooting for, and why? Drop your answer in the comments below. One more thing, some details in this story have been shaped for the sake of telling it well, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the center of it. I had arrived in a rusted flatbed truck, parked 2 blocks away to avoid the valet staff. 69 years old, and I learned long ago that real wealth is a quiet shield, while showing it off is a loud target. My name is Gerald Caldwell, and 2 things have defined my life: the logistics empire I built from nothing, and my daughter Natalie. Natalie was the reason I was standing out there in the freezing cold. She had married Derek 3 years ago. From the very start, I saw through him. I spotted the calculated ambition behind his eyes, the way he sized up every person by the brand of their watch or the cut of their suit. He treated me with a thinly veiled contempt, the kind of exhausting tolerance a man reserves for someone he considers an unfortunate social burden. He was convinced I was a retired blue-collar worker, scraping by on a meager state pension. He assumed my small 2-bedroom suburban house represented the outer boundary of everything I had ever accomplished. I never set him straight. I wanted Natalie to be loved for who she was, not for the massive trust fund sitting quietly in her name. When Derek told me his parents Clifford and Lorraine were flying into town to mark his recent promotion to CEO of Crestline Logistics, he extended me a dinner invitation. It was delivered with a heavy sigh, the unmistakable weight of obligation, rather than any genuine wish for my company. I said yes because I needed to understand exactly what kind of family my daughter had married into. I pushed through the heavy brass doors of the restaurant. The lobby's warmth rolled over me thick with the scent of roasted garlic, seared steak, and expensive perfume. A hostess with a rigid smile looked me over her gaze, snagging briefly on the frayed elbows of my jacket. I gave her Derek's name, and her stiff smile pulled even tighter as she guided me through the crowded dining room toward the private suites at the back. The heavy oak door stood slightly ajar. I stepped inside. The conflict began before a single word was spoken. Clifford and Lorraine occupied the center of the long table, looking precisely as I had imagined they would. Clifford had on a custom-tailored charcoal suit, a massive gold watch gleaming on his wrist like some instrument of intimidation. Lorraine wore a satin dress adorned with diamonds, her face set in an expression of iron judgment. Derek sat alongside them, swirling a glass of deep red wine. Not one of them rose when I walked in. Clifford and Lorraine ran their eyes over my clothing, their faces curdling almost instantly into open, undisguised contempt. Derek didn't offer his hand. He simply waved his wine glass toward the chair at the far end of the table, as distant from them as the room would allow. Natalie wasn't there. Derek muttered that she had slipped out to the restroom to fix her makeup. I pulled out my chair and settled into the heavy, suffocating silence. The psychological assault started the moment the waiter filled the water glasses. Lorraine leaned in diamond-ringed fingers resting on the white tablecloth and fixed me with a smile soaked in condescending pity. She asked how my little house was holding up through the winter, pressing down on the word little as though she were describing a dog house. She went on about how draining it was to heat their vast estate in Grosse Pointe. Clifford joined in, talking loudly about their recent 3-week trip to the Amalfi Coast. He swirled his wine and let his eyes drift pointedly down to my worn work boots. Then he asked what exactly I had done for a living before retiring to my quiet, unremarkable existence. I held his gaze and kept my voice low and steady. I told him I'd worked with my hands my whole life, decades spent managing freight, moving boxes, dealing with trucks. Every word of it was true. I simply left out the part where I came to own 10,000 of those trucks. Clifford let out a short, mocking laugh. He and Lorraine shared a glance of absolute superiority. In their minds, I was filed away immediately as an uneducated warehouse laborer. Derek shifted in his seat, face reddening with deep embarrassment, looking at me as though my presence were a stain on his freshly minted corporate image. The atmosphere in the room turned genuinely toxic. Every remark Lorraine made about fine dining, luxury cars, high society connections was a precisely aimed insult designed to establish dominance. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I sat quietly with my tap water, watching their arrogance with the cold, unhurried patience of a predator, observing its prey walk straight into a trap. The waiter returned and set down expensive cuts of meat and towers of delicate seafood. Clifford didn't touch his food. Instead, he reached into his jacket's inner pocket and produced a thick, crisp white envelope, placing it squarely on the walnut table. He pressed his fingertips to the paper and pushed it slowly across the polished surface until it came to rest directly in front of my plate. The room went deathly quiet. Derek stared at his plate, unwilling to meet my eyes. Lorraine lifted her wineglass for a delicate sip, watching me with a predatory smirk. I looked down at the envelope, then back up at Clifford. I asked him what it was. Clifford answered with brutal, unapologetic directness. He said there was a cashier's check inside for $20,000. A relocation fund, he called it. The terms were absolute and non-negotiable. I was to invent some story about failing health or a craving for a warmer climate pack up my pathetic little house and move myself to a low-tier retirement facility in Florida or Arizona. I was to remove myself entirely from Natalie and Derek's life. My heart beat in a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I asked him why I would ever agree to that. Clifford leaned forward, his voice laced with venom. He stated that Derek had just been named Chief Executive Officer of Crestline Logistics, that Derek now moved in circles of serious wealth and influence. He looked at my faded jacket with undisguised disgust. He told me that my visible poverty, my lack of education, and my lower-class background were social anchors dragging down Derek's rising trajectory. A man of Derek's standing, he said, could not afford to be seen with someone who looked like he belonged in a soup kitchen. I didn't touch the envelope. I turned my gaze slowly toward Derek, the young man I had permitted to marry my only daughter, the man who had stood at an altar and vowed to honor our family. I asked Derek directly whether he agreed with his father. I asked if he genuinely wanted me to pocket that money and disappear from his daughter's life. Derek finally lifted his head. He looked straight at me, his face hardened by greed and unchecked ambition, and gave his cold agreement. He said his career demanded a certain image. He told me that a corporate executive running a company as substantial as Crestline Logistics could not have a father-in-law who looked like a janitor. He told me to take the money and do what was best for everyone. The betrayal hung in the air, vile and suffocating. Derek had sold himself completely to his own vanity. What he didn't know was that the great company he was so proud to lead the corporate empire, fueling his disgusting sense of superiority, had been built by the very hands he was now insulting. He had no idea that the board of directors who had hired him ultimately answered to a blind trust. A blind trust controlled entirely by the man sitting across from him in a frayed corduroy jacket. At that precise moment, the heavy oak door clicked open. Natalie walked back into the private dining room, her face bright and utterly unaware of the execution that had just taken place. She smiled over at me, asking whether they had already put in an order for appetizers. Before anyone could speak, I reached across and slipped the white envelope smoothly into the inner pocket of my jacket. The mood in the room shifted at once. Clifford and Lorraine traded a quick, triumphant glance. Derek exhaled a quiet, barely audible sigh of relief. They were certain I had surrendered. They believed the poor, pathetic old man had taken the bribe out of pure desperation. I looked at my daughter, my warm, kind-hearted Natalie, who deserved so much better than the coward seated at this table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't overturn the table or make a public scene. Anger is the refuge of the powerless, and every ounce of power in that room belonged to me. I rose to my feet slowly, every movement deliberate, every movement calm. I reached into my pants pocket and produced a single crumpled $1 bill. I smoothed it flat between my fingers and set it precisely in the center of my empty plate. I looked straight at Derek and told him the dollar was to cover the cost of my tap water. Then I turned to Natalie and arranged a gentle smile across my face. I told her the winter air had given me a sudden headache, and I needed to head home and lie down. Natalie's face flooded with concern. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me, offering to skip the rest of the dinner and drive me home herself. I kissed her forehead and told her to stay to enjoy the evening with her new family. I promised I'd call her first thing in the morning. As I pulled away from my daughter, I caught one final look at Clifford. He was smirking, carving into his expensive steak with the deep satisfaction of a man who believed he had just purchased the world. I turned my back on all of them and walked out of the private room. I moved through the packed restaurant, the sounds of clinking crystal and wealthy laughter receding behind me. I shouldered open the brass doors and stepped out into the freezing Detroit night. The bitter wind struck my face, but I did not feel the cold. The timid, unassuming old man I had performed for the past 2 hours evaporated instantly. My spine straightened. My eyes hardened into the darkness of the street ahead. I reached into my pocket, past the envelope stuffed with Clifford's filthy money, and pulled out my cell phone. I found the number I needed and dialed. The line rang exactly once before someone picked up. Franklin, my corporate attorney and the architect of my blind trust, spoke quietly on the other end. I skipped any greeting. I spoke with the full, terrifying authority of a man heading into war. I told Franklin they had taken the bait. I told him my son-in-law had crossed the point of no return. I ordered Franklin to launch an immediate, ruthless forensic audit of Derek's executive accounts at Crestline Logistics to trace every single dollar Derek had touched since the board put him in that chair. I stood in the shadow of the street, watching the valet pull a silver Porsche to the restaurant's entrance, already knowing exactly how this story was going to end. The hunt had officially begun, and I intended to tear their fraudulent kingdom all the way down to the foundation. The freezing Detroit wind battered the windshield as I steered my rusted flatbed truck into the underground parking garage of a towering glass skyscraper in the financial district. I bypassed the visitor section entirely and pulled into a secured space that had been reserved in my name for more than 2 decades. The armed guard posted at the private executive elevator didn't ask for identification. He simply nodded with quiet respect and pressed his thumb to the biometric scanner on the wall. The heavy steel doors slid open and carried me up to the 48th floor. I left the poor, pathetic old man down in the cold streets where he belonged. By the time the elevator chimed, my posture was rigid and my gaze had sharpened to stone. I was exactly who I needed to be. The doors opened onto a vast, dimly lit office with a sweeping view of the glittering city below. Franklin stood waiting beside a long walnut conference table. He had been my lead corporate attorney for 30 solid years. A man whose absolute loyalty was rivaled only by the cold ruthlessness he brought into any boardroom. He offered no pleasantries. He did not ask how dinner had gone with my daughter and her in-laws. He already understood why I was there. He simply slid a thick stack of leather-bound corporate files across the polished surface toward me. I peeled off my faded corduroy jacket, draped it over the back of a leather chair, and sat down. I pressed both hands flat against the table, feeling the full accumulated weight of my life pressing back from beneath my palms. I stared at the gold-embossed logo on the top file. Crestline Logistics. Derek loved throwing that corporate name around, as though he had dragged the company up from the earth with his bare hands. He wielded his title of Chief Executive Officer to intimidate waiters, impress his arrogant parents, and diminish me. He had no idea whatsoever what it actually costs to build something from nothing. I constructed this company out of dirt and pure desperation. 30 years ago, my wife Irene passed away unexpectedly. I was left alone in a dark world with a grieving toddler and a crushing mountain of medical debt. I scraped together my last few dollars and bought a single worn cargo truck at a county fleet auction. I worked 20 hours a day hauling heavy freight through freezing sleet and blistering summer heat. I kept little Natalie asleep in a makeshift bed in the passenger seat because I couldn't afford basic childcare. I skipped meals so she could eat. Every dollar I earned went straight back into the business. One struggling truck became a fleet of 10. 10 became 100. In time, what started as an act of desperation became an international logistics network worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Crestline Logistics was built from my blood, my sweat, and a relentless drive to give my daughter a safe world to grow up in. 10 years ago, I accepted that my heart could no longer sustain the grinding corporate pace. Our financial future was permanently secured. I chose to step out of public view, to tend my small suburban garden, live quietly, and watch Natalie grow into the fiercely independent woman she was becoming. I had Franklin draw up the paperwork to place my 70% controlling stake in Crestline Logistics into a highly secure, irrevocable blind trust. I named Franklin as primary executive and had my personal name scrubbed entirely from the public corporate registry. To the outside business world, the founder had simply retired into peaceful anonymity. The executive board was left to run daily operations with no knowledge of my ordinary life. 2 years ago, that same board hired a rising corporate star named Derek to step in as chief executive officer, chosen purely on the strength of an aggressive resume and his talent for wearing sharp suits. Derek walked into that corner office convinced he had conquered the business world entirely on his own terms. When he married my daughter, he looked at my worn work boots, my plain clothes, my modest suburban house, and filed me away immediately as an uneducated failure. He had no idea that the corporation bankrolling his luxury cars, his tailored suits, and his towering arrogance belonged entirely to the quiet old man he was now trying to erase. He believed himself the undisputed king of the castle. He was nothing more than a hired hand working in the dark inside a fortress I had built with my own hands. I looked up at Franklin. He stood motionless across the table waiting for my order. I reached into my shirt pocket and retrieved the crisp white envelope containing the $20,000 bribe Derek and his parents had pressed on me barely an hour ago. I tossed it onto the center of the table. I told Franklin that my son-in-law had made a fatal, irreversible miscalculation. He had read my chosen silence as weakness and my simple life as total defeat. He wanted to purchase my disappearance to protect his precious corporate image. I told Franklin it was time for Derek to discover exactly who owned and controlled that image. I leaned forward and gave the order. I instructed Franklin to legally lift the blind trust's veil without delay. I wanted my name restored on the private executive registry immediately. I demanded full unrestricted access at the highest tier of corporate clearance. Franklin gave a single sharp nod, a cold smile forming at the corner of his mouth. He opened his secure laptop and typed a rapid sequence of commands that instantly dismantled the decade-long anonymity shield protecting my controlling shares. The system chimed softly. Gerald Caldwell was officially back in absolute command of the board. The sleeping giant had been violently awakened by a fool who thought he was hurling stones at a ghost. The wall separating my personal life from my business empire had been demolished completely, but restoring my identity was only the opening move. I wasn't simply going to fire Derek. I needed to know exactly what he had been doing behind my desk. I ordered Franklin to put the accounting team on standby. We were going to open the books. I reached into the inner pocket of my faded corduroy jacket and drew out the crisp white envelope. I set it down on the polished walnut table directly in front of Franklin. The soft thud of the paper seemed to hang in the stillness of the office. I told him to open it. He reached forward his practiced fingers, drawing the cashier's check out through the unsealed flap. He studied the amount $20,000, then raised his eyes to mine with a silent question. I told him that was the exact price my son-in-law had placed on my dignity. $20,000. That was the figure Derek and his parents had settled on as the fair price for erasing me, shipping me off to some budget retirement home, cut off entirely from Natalie's world. Franklin set the check face down on the table. A cold professional fury settled across his features. He had watched me bleed for decades building Crestline Logistics from nothing. He knew about the meals I'd gone, without the nights I'd spent curled up in a freezing truck cab so Natalie could sleep somewhere safe and warm. I fixed my eyes on Franklin and told him what came next. Firing Derek wasn't enough. I wanted his entire world reduced to rubble. I directed him to launch a complete no-mercy forensic audit every executive account Derek had put his hands on from the day the board handed him the keys. Everything changed at that moment. What had started as a personal wound inflicted over expensive steaks and cheap wine had crossed into something else entirely. This was corporate warfare, and I intended to win it. Franklin moved without a hesitation. Within the hour, he had converted the private boardroom into a sealed command center. He assembled a crew of elite forensic accountants, specialists in dismantling fraudulent financial structures from the inside out. The sharpest minds in Detroit with zero ties to Crestline Logistics' own finance team. I took my place at the head of the table, working through bitter black coffee, watching encrypted servers flicker to life around me. I gave the team Derek's executive authorization codes, the same access I had quietly assigned him through the blind trust. My instruction was simple: find every buried transfer, every unauthorized payout, every expense report that smelled wrong. I wanted them to pull back the floor of Derek's high life and show me what was rotting beneath it. The accountants worked without a word. Keyboards clicked in steady, relentless rhythm. On the massive wall monitor, digital files began stacking up years of financial records, unspooling like thread from a reel. For 48 hours, I barely moved from that chair. I sat watching them methodically cut through everything I had spent my life constructing. My mind kept drifting back to the early years, hunched over a kitchen table at midnight, checking every figure by hand, making sure each driver got paid. What he was owed, each vendor's invoice settled on schedule. Honesty wasn't a policy for me. It was the bedrock I built everything on. I never took a single cent that did not belong to me. Watching Derek's name sit atop my executive accounts turned my stomach. He'd parked himself in my seat and was running my company like his personal expense account. Deep into the second night, Deborah, the lead accountant, a woman with a sharp, precise gaze, stopped typing mid-sentence. She exchanged a look with Franklin, then rotated her monitor to face me. What they'd found, she said, wasn't a miscalculation. It wasn't a stray line item. It was a deliberate, sustained hemorrhage. She opened a layered diagram of financial transfers on the main screen. For the past 18 months, Derek had been methodically working around the board's oversight committee. He wasn't just a snob with expensive taste. The audit was revealing something far uglier: a cold, calculating criminal. He'd built a web of dummy shell companies, each one fronting as a legitimate vendor, each one sitting atop a contract for logistics services that had never been performed. The money draining out of Crestline Logistics' treasury wasn't trickling. It was gushing millions of dollars at a time, channeled into these ghost accounts and vanishing. I studied the figures on the screen. The scale of it hit me like a physical blow. He was systematically draining the company I had built at enormous personal cost, funneling it all into his own private empire. This man had looked at me with contempt. He had dismissed me as dead weight, and behind my back, he was a common thief leeching off everything my name stood for. Transaction after transaction told the same story: pure, unrestrained greed. The shell companies led the accountants straight to offshore accounts under Derek's exclusive control. He had dismantled the safeguards I'd constructed when I stepped away a decade ago. He'd forged sign-off signatures from department heads who never knew their names were on the documents. He dressed up the quarterly reports to paper over the craters he was blowing, in the Treasury delivering glossy, fabricated growth narratives to a board that had no reason to doubt him while he was hollowing the company out from below. The cold fury in my chest was absolute. He was ransacking the future I had put together for Natalie. He was robbing thousands of decent workers who counted on Crestline Logistics to put food on their tables. I turned to Franklin. The case was airtight: digital trails, falsified invoices, offshore account numbers, all of it documented. Derek was staring down serious federal charges. The kind of corporate embezzlement we were looking at carried sentences measured in decades in maximum security facilities. Franklin asked whether to call the authorities. Now have Derek walked out of his office in handcuffs come morning. I let a long pause settle before slowly shaking my head. A quiet arrest solved nothing. No, they had publicly stripped me of my dignity. They had slid a check across a restaurant table and told me to make myself disappear. They were convinced no one could touch them. A hushed corporate scandal would let them slink away, and that I would never allow. I wanted Derek to experience the same burning public exposure he had tried to force on me. I told Franklin to build an airtight dossier, every stolen dollar, documented every thread of evidence secured, and then to prepare for a complete total demolition. But there was no time to pace ourselves. Deborah cut in. She had pulled up a fresh internal memo Derek had just pushed to the board. He was engineering something large-scale, a maneuver aimed at seizing what remained of the company from beneath the blind trust entirely. The clock had just accelerated. Deborah's hands worked fast across the keyboard, mapping the route the stolen millions had actually traveled. Those offshore accounts weren't the endpoint. They were a way station, a smokescreen set up to mask the capital's true destination. A second layer of encrypted banking records came up on the conference room screen. I left my chair and moved toward the monitor. This was no longer an abstract corporate theft. It had become something that went straight to the bone. Derek wasn't parking money overseas for his own future use. He was cycling it back into the country through a deliberately tangled pipeline, fake consulting arrangements, phantom marketing contracts, anonymous family trusts layered on top of each other, and the named beneficiaries of those fraudulent trusts, Clifford and Lorraine. I stood in the dim room staring at the numbers. Everything clicked into place at once, cold and merciless. The lavish lifestyle Clifford had paraded in front of me at dinner hadn't been built on sharp investments or decades of honest effort. The whole gilded facade, every last piece of it, was a fabrication underwritten entirely by money drained from my company. Deborah drilled into the expenditure reports attached to the family trust. There were the receipts for the 3-week Amalfi Coast trip Clifford had bragged about so loudly over his steak. There were the invoices, custom charcoal suits, monogrammed luggage, the diamond pieces Lorraine displayed like royal regalia. There were wire transfer records covering 2 imported luxury vehicles, titled in Clifford's name, purchased outright with funds skimmed from a Crestline Logistics shipping contract. Then Deborah opened the single largest file in the entire audit. 2 weeks prior, Derek had moved $4 million out of a Crestline Logistics emergency reserve account and wired it straight into Lorraine's private holding company. Within days, that money had paid for a newly commissioned 80-foot yacht currently sitting at a premier marina in Miami. I stood very still as the full staggering brazenness of it settled over me. I found myself back at that restaurant table, the crisp white envelope being pushed across the walnut surface toward my plate. They had sat there, looked me in the face, and offered me $20,000 to erase myself from my daughter's life. They had called me a drag on their image, a man not worth being seen with. And the grotesque truth was, the money they'd used to try to buy me off had been taken from the very treasury I'd spent my life filling. They had handed me my own savings as a bribe to disappear. A surge of white-hot rage rose through me, pressing hard against the composure I had kept locked in place all night. My mind went back to the grinding early years of building Crestline Logistics. I remembered gathering my first dozen drivers in a cold warehouse and making them a promise, fair wages, a solid pension fund built from our very first profits so their families would never go hungry the way mine had. I handled the corporate treasury like something sacred because it represented the financial lifeline of thousands of decent, hardworking people. Derek had been raiding that treasury like a personal ATM to fund yachts for 2 parasites who had never broken a real sweat in their lives. I forced the burning anger back down into my chest and held it there. Rage makes a man sloppy, and I couldn't afford a single mistake. I let it cool, compress, and harden into something slower and far more dangerous. Firing Derek wasn't the answer anymore. That would have been doing him a favor. A quiet termination would give his parents time to hide the stolen assets shelter behind a bankruptcy filing and cast themselves as victims of their son's crimes. I wanted no such clean exit for any of them. I wanted Clifford and Lorraine to know, in every bone in their bodies, the same powerlessness, the same poverty, the same public disgrace they had tried to impose on me. I looked across the table at Franklin. He stood reading the resolve that had settled over my face like stone. I told him we were done talking about a standard executive termination. We were going to bring federal racketeering statutes into this. I directed Franklin to run down every physical asset Clifford and Lorraine had acquired in the last 18 months, every vehicle, every piece of jewelry, every vacation property, and that yacht and tie, each one legally to the embezzlement case. When federal authorities finally made their move, I wanted the entire family caught in the net at the same moment. Clifford and Lorraine were not oblivious bystanders stumbling into a son's sudden wealth. The paper trail proved they were active accomplices knowingly collecting stolen corporate capital funneled through fraudulent consulting firms, registered in their own names. Franklin gave a sharp nod, something predatory flickering in his eyes. He immediately set about drafting the legal instruments needed to freeze civilian assets connected to corporate fraud. I told him to prepare the guillotine carefully and precisely. We weren't going to strike tonight. We were going to let Derek take the stage at his grand corporate merger gala this weekend. We were going to let him stand beneath those bright lights in front of Detroit's business elite, convinced the pathetic old father-in-law had been swept off the board. We were going to let Clifford and Lorraine parade around in their stolen diamonds, sip their expensive champagne, and soak up the admiration of their counterfeit high society crowd. I wanted them standing at the very peak of their false glory. The higher they climbed on that pedestal of lies, the more catastrophic the collapse would be. Deborah slid a printed summary of the stolen funds and linked family accounts across to me. I folded the document and tucked it into my shirt pocket, right beside the $20,000 cashier's check Clifford had handed me at the restaurant. Both papers pressed against my chest, a complete record of everything that was about to come down on them. I thanked the accounting team for their meticulous, relentless work. I told them to seal the files and crypt every server, and say nothing to anyone until I gave them the word. I took my faded corduroy jacket from the back of the leather chair and walked toward the private executive elevator. The first pale light of morning was stretching across the Detroit skyline, cold and flat, over a city that didn't know what was coming. Derek genuinely believed he had outmaneuvered a simple, ignorant old man. He was certain his grip on power was total. He was about to learn what happens when you try to rob the man who designed the fortress you've been living in. I stepped into the elevator, my thoughts already mapping the precise sequence of events at the gala. The trap was assembled, the evidence was locked down, and the ending was written. The heavy slam of a luxury car door broke the quiet of my suburban street. I was on my knees in the front yard, pressing fresh soil around a row of newly planted dahlias. My hands were deep in dark earth, the kind of honest grounding work that had always kept me level. I heard the crisp, impatient strike of expensive leather shoes coming up my concrete driveway. I didn't need to raise my head to know who it was. Derek threw a long shadow across my garden. He stood there in a tailored silver suit, eyeing my modest single-story home, as though it were something contagious. No greeting, no courtesy. He simply ordered me inside, announcing that the neighborhood was offensive to look at. I got to my feet, deliberately rubbed the soil from my hands with an old rag, and walked him into the house I had purchased 30 years ago to raise his wife. Derek moved through my living room, wearing an expression of open revulsion, making a point of not wiping his expensive shoes on the mat. His gaze swept across the faded floral sofa, the worn brick fireplace, the framed photographs of Natalie's childhood, arranged along the mantel. He scoffed without bothering to conceal it, as though my entire life amounted to evidence of failure. He dropped a heavy leather briefcase onto my small wooden coffee table and snapped it open with unnecessary force. He yanked out a stack of dense legal documents and threw them down. He told me to sit and read. I stayed on my feet. I looked at the papers, then at the man who seemed to believe a borrowed corporate title entitled him to behave like royalty in my own home. Derek informed me that the $20,000 check his father had produced at the restaurant was merely the opening offer. He'd decided to make my removal from his life a legally binding matter. He jabbed a manicured finger at the printed pages, tapping the paper to underscore his authority. He explained that what lay in front of me was an ironclad non-disclosure agreement combined with a full renunciation of rights. I was to swear legally that I would never speak of the financial bribe his parents had offered, and I would formally relinquish any future claim to Natalie's financial support. He was demanding that I sign away both my voice and any connection to my daughter's life. I asked him what he planned to do if I refused. Derek moved closer, shrinking the space between us, his voice dropping to a low, venom-laced whisper. He threatened to sever my relationship with Natalie completely. He claimed control over their joint finances, their living situation, and the full arc of her future. He promised to turn what remained of my life into something unlivable and vowed I would never see Natalie or any grandchildren if I chose to push back. He spoke about my daughter not as someone he loved, but as an acquisition, a possession he wielded. He was holding my family up as collateral to protect his own fraudulent image. My own flesh and blood had become a bargaining chip for his vanity. I looked down at the contract on the coffee table. I read the language designed to formalize my financial irrelevance and my permanent exile. A younger version of me, the man who built a freight empire through blistered hands and raw, unyielding fury, might have put Derek through the wall right where he stood. I had demolished far more formidable opponents for lesser provocations. But decades had taught me something those men never learned. Patience applied with precision hits harder than any fist. I showed him nothing. No anger, no grief, not a flicker. I walked to the kitchen, scrubbed the garden soil from my hands, and dried them without hurrying. I came back to the living room, picked up a cheap plastic pen from the counter, and bent over the coffee table. I signed my name at the very bottom of his extortion document, slowly, deliberately, with a calm so complete it could have passed for a smile. Derek grabbed the papers the instant my pen left the page. He forced them back into his briefcase chest, swelling with satisfaction. In his mind, he had marched into an old man's house and bent him to his will. He felt like a king who had never been touched. His arrogance left no room for what had actually just occurred. He had just handed me a signed written record of his attempt to extort the majority shareholder of his own company. He had put his blackmail in ink. Derek zipped his briefcase shut and crossed the room toward the front door, every step radiating unearned triumph. At the threshold, he turned back to deliver one final calculated insult. He announced that he was hosting a major corporate merger gala for Crestline Logistics this coming weekend. In his telling, this gala was the crowning achievement of his entire professional life, an evening of breathtaking excess that would etch his name permanently into the city's corporate history. He made one thing unmistakably clear. I was to stay far away from that building. My showing up, he said, would mortify every distinguished person in that room. The hotel's security detail would haul me out the front entrance he promised, and the spectacle would destroy whatever shred of dignity he had left to protect in front of his board. I let him finish. I stood there in the middle of my unremarkable little living room and let every word wash over me. This was the man who had quietly looted my company's treasury millions of dollars redirected to pay for his parents' luxury yacht. The same man now grinding my daughter down day by day from the inside out. I gave him nothing in return. No anger, no tremor in my voice. I told Derek I took his point entirely and that I hoped the evening went beautifully for him. He curled his lip, said something vile beneath his breath, turned on his heel, and was gone. Through the front window, I watched his car disappear around the corner. As far as he was concerned, he had finished me, cut me loose from the board, neutralized the threat. What he could not see was that I had already moved into a completely different game. The documents were executed. Every piece of the trap was in position. The weekend was nearly here. He was certain he'd put me in the ground. He was about to learn he'd only picked up the shovel for me. Dusk had barely settled when rain started driving hard against my roof. I sat alone at the kitchen table with Derek's extortion contract spread out in front of me, the one he had compelled me to sign only hours before. In my mind, I was walking through every legal step Franklin would set in motion come Monday. The house around me was perfectly, almost oppressively still, and then urgent frenzied knocking at the front door. Nothing like Derek's entitled heavy-handed bang. This was someone desperate, someone frightened. I moved through the hallway and opened the door to find my daughter Natalie on the porch, drenched through shaking violently in the cold rain. Her coat was thin and useless against the downpour, soaked dark, her hair stuck flat to the sides of her face. The resilient, radiant woman I had spent a lifetime raising, she looked broken open. Not a single word came out of her. She stepped forward and folded into me, face pressed into my shoulder, and the sob that came out of her wasn't quiet. I drew her inside without a word, shut out the wet and the cold, and locked the door behind us. I brought her to the kitchen. A heavy fleece blanket went around her shoulders. A mug of hot cocoa went into her hands. I didn't ask a single question. I already understood the source of every one of those tears. I settled into the chair across from her and gave her the time she needed. Natalie curved her shaking fingers around the warmth of the mug. Her gaze dropped to the worn surface of the old walnut table. She started talking in halting pieces. She'd gone out to the grocery store earlier that day, picked up a small load of essentials, and when she went to pay her card, wouldn't go through. She tried the next one, then the one after that. Every account connected to her name had been locked shut. She rang Derek to find out if something had gone wrong at the bank. He didn't ask if she was all right. He detonated. She was irresponsible with money, he told her, a liability to the image he had worked to build, and he'd frozen every account as a corrective measure, as a lesson. Under the table, my hands had become fists. This was deliberate, methodical control. Derek was severing her financial lifeline, piece by piece, engineering her dependence until she had nowhere left to turn and no means to leave. But cutting off the money was only the beginning. Natalie steeled herself and told me what had actually driven her out into the storm that night. Derek had walked in from the office an hour after that call, a thick sheaf of legal papers tucked under his arm. He'd dropped them on the kitchen island and told her to sign. Right then, no discussion, the paperwork was a full transfer of assets, specifically her mother's private inheritance fund. Long before Crestline Logistics existed, before the blind trusts or the offshore accounts, my late wife Irene had received a modest life insurance payout from her own parents. Irene put every cent of it away for Natalie deliberately carefully. It was meant to be untouchable, a quiet reserve our daughter could fall back on if her life ever came apart. Derek had always known the money was there. He spun Natalie a story about needing the capital as collateral for a bridge loan they were supposedly purchasing a brand new estate out in Grosse Pointe. Temporary, he said. A technicality the bank required to finalize the mortgage. When Natalie slowed down and said she wanted to actually read what she was signing, Derek turned vicious. He called her a burden who gave nothing back. He said her hesitation proved she didn't respect his judgment or his standing, and he issued an ultimatum: sign the inheritance over before sunrise tomorrow, or consider the marriage done. I sat across from my daughter and watched the last piece of Derek's blueprint fall into alignment with a sickening, absolute clarity. He was never buying anything in Grosse Pointe. This was a clean-out operation. Franklin's forensic work had already laid it bare. Derek had been draining my company for months, funneling the stolen capital into his parents' extravagant lifestyle and a network of offshore accounts he controlled alone. The timeline now snapped into focus with brutal precision. He knew the merger gala was coming. He knew it would move enormous sums of temporary capital through the company. He was going to ride that surge to strip what remained from the Crestline Logistics treasury and funnel it into accounts no one could trace. Then he would disappear. He'd take the corporate millions, the yacht sitting in Clifford and Lorraine's name, and leave Detroit without a backward glance. But greed had its claws in him too deeply to permit even that. He wanted Irene's money. He was going to hollow out Natalie's final protection, absorb her mother's legacy into his hidden accounts, and file for divorce once he was airborne and headed somewhere no extradition treaty could reach. He planned to throw Natalie away, no money, no recourse, no dignity remaining. Something cold moved through me and went still. I watched tears trace lines down my daughter's face and felt the weight of everything I knew pressing against my chest. Every paternal instinct I possessed screamed at me to tell her all of it right there at that table. That I owned the tower where Derek went to work each morning. That his career, his reputation, his freedom, all of it fit in the palm of my hand. That she was the future heir to a fortune measured in the hundreds of millions, and her husband was already a man without a future. But I said none of it. Natalie didn't need the architect of his destruction sitting across from her. She needed the man who had held her hand through every hard thing. She needed her father, steady present safe. And I needed Derek to spend the next 48 hours feeling like he owned the world. If Natalie knew the truth now, something in her relief, her posture, the light coming back into her eyes might reach him. And Derek could not suspect even for a moment that anything had shifted. He had to walk into that gala absolutely certain the stage was his. I reached across the walnut table and closed both hands around hers. I held her gaze. What I said next, I said without a single qualifier. She was not returning to that house. Tonight she would sleep in the bedroom she had grown up in. She would leave every call and every message from her husband unanswered. The bank accounts were to be ignored, and under no circumstances was she to put her name on those papers. Natalie looked at me with a voice barely holding together and asked me what on earth we could possibly do. Derek's power terrified her, the reach of it, the corporate machinery he could bring to bear on both their lives. From where she sat, he held every advantage. I reached up and brushed the tear from her cheek. My voice stayed low. It stayed level. It carried the settled, unshakable weight of someone who had already seen how this ends. I told her that, before this weekend was out, Derek would not have the power to harm her or anyone ever again. The nightmare, I told her, was finished. She simply didn't know it yet. She settled back into the chair and let her eyes fall closed, and the breath that left her was long and exhausted and full of release. Her trust in me was complete. She didn't sit there and puzzle over how a retired working man might bring down a commanding chief executive. Her father had given his word. That was enough. I got up, cleared the mugs from the table, and walked Natalie back to her old room. I stayed until the quiet, even cadence of her breathing told me she was finally asleep. Then I returned to the kitchen and picked up my phone. Whatever small reserve of mercy I might have still harbored for Derek, or his insufferable parents watching the pain move through my daughter's eyes, had burned every last trace of it away. This had stopped being a corporate matter. This was a full reckoning, something absolute and overdue, I called Franklin on his secure line and told him to push the timeline forward. The trap would close at the gala, and when it did, it would be the most devastating public unraveling this city had ever produced. I left Natalie sleeping safely in the room she'd grown up in and drove out into the financial district while the sky was still black, arriving well before first light touched the Detroit skyline. The city sat in a cold pre-dawn hush. Franklin was already at his desk when I walked in, immaculate as always, a fresh pot of coffee sending steam off the glass surface beside him. We skipped every formality. Both of us understood the situation had shifted. I settled into the heavy leather chair across from him and told him it was time to bring the full weight down. I directed Franklin to exercise the absolute authority granted by my majority stake, an immediate total executive freeze across every layer of Crestline logistics, initiated without warning and with no room for negotiation. My emergency shareholder privileges gave me the unilateral power to lock the company's financial arteries entirely. Franklin drafted the mandate with the kind of cold efficiency the moment demanded. The document stripped all board-level transaction authority in a single stroke. Every executive account locked, all outbound wire transfers halted, the treasury paralyzed. I picked up a heavy black pen and put my name at the bottom of the page. In that moment, Derek's access to the company vault ceased to exist. He simply hadn't been told yet. The response inside the Crestline Logistics Executive Suite was swift and gloriously chaotic. Franklin tracked the internal communications from his encrypted terminal. By 9 in the morning, the board was in a state of full-blown panic. For a decade, they had operated under the comfortable assumption that the anonymous founder was a passive hands-off presence, someone content to collect his annual dividends and stay invisible. Now the ghost had come to life, brought his fist down hard, and sealed the vault. Messages flew across the secure servers in a frenzy. Vice presidents were rattled and frightened. Nobody could explain why the founder had triggered a hard freeze. Every department head scrambled to audit their own corner of the company, convinced they might be the target of this sudden and unexplained corporate fury. I gave them no room to breathe. I instructed Franklin to send the board a second directive sharper and more alarming than the first. As controlling shareholder, I formally demanded a mandatory disclosure meeting, but I didn't place it on some forgettable Tuesday morning in a conference room. I scheduled it for Saturday evening, right at the center of the grand corporate merger gala Derek had spent weeks arranging to crown his own manufactured greatness. Legal counsel was directed to compel the attendance of the full executive board, chief executive officer included. Derek would be required to host the very gathering designed to bury him. Franklin composed the corporate summons with surgical precision, making certain my identity remained sealed beneath the protections of the blind trust. To Derek and the board, it arrived simply as a directive from the founder. The notice stated that the majority shareholder would step out of anonymity to personally address the executive team on the company's future. No board member could decline. No legal argument could allow Derek to refuse. He was compelled by his own obligations to stand on the stage where he would be destroyed. But the corporate machinery was only half of what needed to happen. Removing Derek from his position was a business decision. Putting him in a federal penitentiary was a matter of conscience. I watched Franklin lift his secure landline and route entirely around local law enforcement. He called directly to the lead investigator at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Franklin had spent the prior 48 hours assembling the forensic audit into a bulletproof federal dossier. He spoke in a measured, deliberate tone, walking the investigator through the full scope of Derek's crimes. He described the network of dummy shell companies in methodical detail. He listed the fabricated vendor invoices one by one. He provided the exact routing numbers, tracing millions of dollars as they flowed outward funding luxury yachts, European travel, and the lavish lifestyle Derek had constructed for Clifford and Lorraine. The agents required no persuasion. The documentation was airtight, the trail unambiguous. It showed a man who had treated a multinational corporation as a personal account, plundering it with no restraint. Franklin coordinated the precise timing of the operation. A tactical white-collar crime unit would be deployed quietly to the service corridors of the hotel on the night of the gala. They would remain completely out of sight until the moment arrived. The instant I laid the evidence bare from that stage, they would move. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling window in Franklin's office, looking down at the financial district coming alive below. Thousands of people streaming to work, none of them aware of the invisible earthquake already moving through the foundations of Crestline Logistics. Somewhere above me, Derek was almost certainly settled into his enormous corner office, admiring himself in the glass, with no idea that every corporate card in his wallet was now useless plastic. He believed he was executing a flawless scheme, that he could pillage my company, reduce my daughter to rubble, throw $20,000 at me like a tip, and walk away untouched. He thought the designer suit and the fabricated title made him invulnerable. He had never grasped the thing that actually matters. Real power isn't a corner office or a tailored jacket. Real power is the ability to dismantle a man's entire world without ever raising your voice. The legal trap was locked, loaded, and calibrated. Every exit had been methodically closed off. The federal unit was briefed and in position. The board was already frightened. The stolen money sat frozen and inaccessible. All that remained was Saturday night. The smell of cedar sawdust and motor oil has always settled something deep in me. It was late Wednesday afternoon, and I was standing in the middle of aisle 4 at Grayson & Sons Hardware. I had on my faded denim work jeans, worn work boots, and a thick canvas shirt that had seen better decades. I was loading 50 lb bags of organic potting soil onto a heavy metal flatbed cart. My hands were rough and dark with earth. A man needs to keep his hands in the dirt. I have always believed that. It's how he stays honest about where he started. Building Crestline Logistics into a multinational powerhouse had meant custom-tailored suits and sterile glass boardrooms for years on end. But the raw, unglamorous labor that built the foundation of my life, I never let that leave me. I hauled the 6th bag onto the cart, feeling the familiar satisfying pull in my shoulders. I pushed the squeaking cart toward the front registers and let the simple rhythm of the afternoon settle over me. The local hardware store was a sanctuary, a place that had no use for empty titles or performance. I was at the checkout counter reaching into my pocket for my worn leather wallet when a voice shrill and completely wrong for the room cut through the quiet like a crack. I turned slowly. Clifford and Lorraine stood just inside the sliding entrance doors. They looked like a bad joke. Clifford, who had an ivory merino sweater draped over his shoulders, paired with spotless tan loafers that had plainly never encountered actual ground. Lorraine was buttoned into a tailored silk trench coat, a designer handbag on her arm, worth more than what the cashier in front of me earned in 6 months. These two had no business being here. My best guess was they'd taken a wrong turn looking for some upscale garden boutique in the neighboring suburb and stumbled in by accident. Clifford found me almost immediately. His gaze traveled from my dirt-caked work boots up to the thick canvas shirt, then to the heavy soil bags stacked on my cart. A slow, ugly smile moved across his face. He elbowed Lorraine and aimed a manicured finger straight at me. He walked over to my checkout lane with Lorraine in tow, not bothering to lower his voice, making sure Eugene, the older gentleman who had worked that register for as long as I had been shopping here, a man I had known for 15 years, could hear every syllable. Clifford looked at the bags of dirt and produced a loud theatrical laugh that bounced off the high warehouse ceiling. He told me it was entirely fitting to find me here, dressed like a vagrant hauling fertilizer. He said this was precisely the kind of low station I was destined for, now that his brilliant son had taken permanent control of my company. I stood without moving, no clenched fists, no sharpness in my voice, no rebuttal at all. I simply looked directly into Clifford's eyes. My mind went to the massive 80-foot yacht sitting in Miami, the one he was out there enjoying right now. Every dollar that paid for it had been lifted from my company's treasury. He was a parasite, openly mocking the host that kept him alive. Lorraine moved forward next, trailing a cloud of heavy, expensive perfume, so overpowering it smothered the honest working smell of the store entirely. The look she turned on me held nothing back, pure, unveiled contempt. She announced loudly that it was a genuine blessing to see this, that I had finally found my rightful station. She went on about how Derek was going to transform Crestline Logistics at the gala that weekend and scrub away every remnant of my outdated blue-collar imprint on the company. She practically radiated spite as she talked up the upcoming corporate merger gala. Her son, she declared to anyone within earshot, was on the verge of becoming the most powerful chief executive in the entire state. She went through the list, imported champagne, a celebrity guest rolled the glittering future her family was walking into. Then she dropped her eyes to my worn work boots and informed me that people of my station belong exactly where I was caked in soil and visible to polite society. She told me to enjoy digging in the dirt while the real architects of the world built something that would last. Clifford chuckled quietly alongside her, adjusting his ivory merino sweater, and added that they would make a point to raise a glass to my miserable retirement from out on the water. I let every word land. I kept my eyes level and my expression still. I did not defend a single thing, not my choices, not my clothes, not my name. I simply let them talk, let them heap their contempt into a pile of their own making. They were certain they were humiliating a broken old man in a public place. They had no conception that they were addressing the person who had already designed their destruction, down to the final detail. Every cruel syllable from Lorraine's mouth was just one more reminder of Natalie's face the night before. Shivering in my kitchen, every account frozen her inheritance being threatened by the very people now sneering at me across a checkout lane. That memory did not make me hot with anger. It made me colder, quieter, more certain. Their arrogance was a blindfold they'd buckled on themselves. The federal agents were already staged and waiting. The corporate trap was sealed tight, every document signed and ready. Each insult they threw at me in that hardware store only drove another nail into the lid of their own coffin. I turned back to Eugene, the cashier, a man I had known for 15 years, who was watching Clifford and Lorraine with the kind of quiet professional disdain only a decent person can produce. I laid 3 crisp $100 bills on the counter for the organic soil. I told him in a calm, unhurried voice to keep whatever was left over and get those grandchildren of his something good for the weekend. Eugene gave me a respectful nod and paid no attention whatsoever to the 2 obnoxious figures behind me. He passed me my receipt and sent me off with a good day. I gripped the handle of the flatbed cart and rolled it right past Clifford and Lorraine. Not a word, not a backward glance. I walked out through the sliding glass doors at my own pace and into the bright afternoon light. I lifted the heavy soil bags into the bed of my old truck, feeling the familiar weight of the earth in my hands. Saturday night's storm was coming, and I was completely ready to stand in it. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, its heavy brass pendulum working through its steady, unhurried arc. I sat by myself at the small kitchen table, the suburban neighborhood dead quiet all around me. A single overhead lamp threw sharp white light across the thick stacks of legal documents spread out in front of me. Tomorrow night was the grand corporate merger gala. Tomorrow night, Derek was convinced he would plant his flag as an untouchable figure in the corporate world. I turned another page of the forensic audit and ran the tip of my pen down the columns of stolen millions. There was a strange, almost eerie stillness inside me. The fury that had burned so intensely throughout the past week had exhausted itself completely. What remained in its place was cold, precise, and far more lethal. The absolute certainty of a man who has already measured the grave. My phone vibrated against the wooden table, a hard, sudden sound in all that silence. Franklin. I picked up on the first ring, keeping my voice low so as not to wake Natalie down the hall. He didn't waste a syllable. The federal snare, he told me, was officially armed. The lead investigator at the FBI Financial Crimes Division had personally reviewed the final dossier we submitted. The forged invoices, the offshore routing numbers, the web of dummy shell companies, every piece of it irrefutable. Franklin confirmed that a tactical unit of federal agents would arrive at the hotel the following evening in unmarked vehicles. They would place themselves in the service corridors, the underground parking facility, and the private security rooms well before a single guest walked through the front entrance. They would hold there in total silence, invisible to every oblivious socialite sipping champagne out in the ballroom. They were waiting for my signal. The moment I brought the fraud into the open on that stage, the agents would lock down the entire venue. Nobody would walk out. The corporate guillotine wasn't merely raised. It had been oiled hone to a fine edge, and the executioner had his hand on the release. I thanked Franklin for his meticulous work and ended the call. I gathered the audit summaries, the bank transfer logs, the photographic record of Clifford and Lorraine's luxury purchases. I squared the stack carefully and slid everything into a heavy, dark leather portfolio. I ran my palm across the smooth grain of the cover. This was not a folder full of paperwork. It was a weapon forged from the raw material of their own bottomless greed. It held the complete proof of Derek's systematic theft and Clifford's knowing, eager participation. It documented the precise financial mechanisms they had used to bankroll their counterfeit high society lives. And it was the very instrument that would now pull those lives down into public ruin. I pressed the brass clasp shut with a firm click. The sound carried a finality to it, like a prison door catching in its frame. There was no mercy left to dispense. Mercy belongs to people who stumble into error. Derek and his parents had not stumbled. They had made a deliberate predatory calculation to tear my family apart for the sake of their own vanity. I set the portfolio on the table and walked down the quiet hallway to my bedroom. I opened the deep cedar closet and reached all the way to the back. What I pulled out was a heavy protective garment bag that hadn't been touched in exactly 10 years. I drew down the zipper to reveal a bespoke midnight blue suit cut from the finest Italian wool. I had it commissioned for the night I formally retired and handed the reins of Crestline Logistics to the board of directors. It was the founder's armor. For a decade, I had been content in faded denim and worn work boots, content to let the corporate world forget who had built their empire from nothing. I had settled into that quiet life and genuinely believed the fighting was behind me. But Derek and Clifford had chosen war. They had forced the man who designed their entire fortress to walk back onto the field. I carried the suit to the ironing board standing in the corner. I plugged in the iron and stood watching the steam begin to rise into the cool air as the plate came up to heat. I laid the midnight blue trousers across the board and pressed the fabric with slow, deliberate care. The steady hiss of the steam, the smooth travel of the iron, they settled something in me. The task was simple and repetitive, but it felt like a ritual. With each slow pass, I was smoothing away the invisible, dismissed old man they had laughed at in the hardware store. I was ironing sharp, unforgiving creases into the cloth, preparing the uniform of a man who had come to settle an account. I thought about Natalie in her childhood bedroom, just down the hall, her heart ground to pieces by a man who had seen her as nothing more than a temporary financial asset. I thought about Derek's arrogance as he stood in my living room and demanded I sign away everything I had built and everything my daughter was owed. I thought about Clifford laughing at my dirty hands while dressed in clothes bought with my stolen money. Each memory fed the cold machinery turning inside me. What I had uncovered by this point was only the beginning. The hardest part, the moment that would finally show me the full depth of the betrayal, was still just ahead. Before we get there, tell me this. If someone you had quietly trusted for years turned out to be working against you the entire time, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you wait and let the proof build until there was no escape for them? They were convinced they sat at the very top of a glittering mountain, lords of everything beneath them. What they couldn't see was that the mountain was a volcano, and I was the one holding the detonator. I hung the freshly pressed suit on a heavy wooden valet stand beside the window. The dark, rich fabric seemed to pull the light out of the room, rather than reflect it, radiating a dense, wordless authority. Next to it, I laid a crisp white dress shirt and a silver silk tie. I worked a pair of black Oxford shoes until they caught the light, like dark mirrors erasing every trace of the gardening soil Clifford had found so endlessly amusing. The physical transformation was nearly complete. Come tomorrow evening, the contemptible low-class father-in-law they had written off so completely would cease to exist. Walking through those gilded doors in his place would be the absolute majority shareholder of Crestline Logistics. I moved back into the kitchen and clicked off the overhead lamp, leaving the room in darkness. The leather portfolio sat on the table, a dark shape against the polished wood. The collision course was locked in now, past any possibility of reversal. Physics and consequence had taken the wheel entirely. Derek had raised his entire kingdom on a scaffolding of lies, stolen money, and contempt for everyone around him. Tomorrow night, the full weight of what he'd done would come down on his head. He had engineered a grand spectacle, a stage on which to cement himself in front of the city's most powerful people. I was going to give him exactly that. I was going to give him an audience. I stood in the quiet dark of my house, watching the empty street through the window. Not a trace of fear, not a flicker of hesitation. I was ready in a way I had never been before. The long season of patience and silence had run its course. Tomorrow, the world would hear the blade fall. The grand ballroom of the city hotel was a cathedral of glass and gold. An enormous crystal chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, scattering warm, fractured light across a sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. Expensive orchids and imported champagne perfumed the air. A jazz trio played a seamless melody from a raised platform in the corner, the perfect accompaniment to the illusion of total, unassailable success. Politicians, bank executives, and industry leaders filled the room. To the uninitiated eye, it was a celebration of corporate triumph. To me, it was a crime scene. Every chandelier, every velvet drape, every silver platter piled with caviar had been paid for with the lifeblood of Crestline Logistics. An hour earlier, I had stood in the quiet of my modest living room and gone through the final legal documents one last time. Franklin had called on a secure line to confirm the trap was fully primed. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit had reviewed our audit dossier with exhaustive care. They had traced every forged invoice and every offshore shell company directly back to Derek. Franklin assured me that federal agents were already in position, standing by in the service corridors, invisible to every oblivious guest inside. There was absolutely no room left for mercy. I had spent that last hour in my bedroom, pressing the bespoke midnight blue suit I had kept hidden in a cedar closet for 10 years. It was the founder's armor, a garment commissioned for the night I originally stepped down. The moment I drew the heavy wool jacket across my shoulders, the humble, invisible old man they had mocked disappeared completely. I picked up the dark leather folder, holding the full, irrefutable proof of Derek's theft, and Clifford's willing participation. The collision course was set and could not be undone. Now, I stood in the shadowed alcove of the mezzanine balcony, entirely out of sight, surveying the floor below, with the cold composure of a hunter watching his quarry from the ridge. Derek occupied the exact center of the room, holding a crystal flute of champagne as though it were a scepter. A tight circle of senior board members and wealthy investors surrounded him. He threw his head back in a broad laugh, teeth catching the light. His tailored tuxedo fit without a single crease out of place, projecting the unmistakable aura of untouchable power. He looked every inch the man who had conquered the world. He was performing the role of visionary chief executive with absolute conviction, blissfully unaware that his corporate cards had been frozen and his executive authority stripped away by my hand more than 24 hours ago. He was a ghost presiding over his own celebration, playing the invincible king while standing on a trapdoor. A few yards away, Clifford and Lorraine were staging a spectacle of their own. They drifted through the gathering of dignitaries with the deliberate ease of royalty reviewing their subjects. Clifford had his hand clamped on the shoulder of a prominent city alderman, bending close to murmur some fabricated story about his financial acumen. On his wrist sat a diamond-studded watch I knew with absolute certainty had been purchased with funds diverted from our logistics payroll. Lorraine was worse still. She moved through the room with a heavy diamond necklace blazing at her throat, her satin dress adorned with diamonds trailing behind her with every step. She was presenting herself to the wives of our largest shareholders as though she were the matriarch of a long-established dynasty. They were parading stolen wealth, like a flag drunk on the deference of people who would cross the street to avoid them if they knew the truth. Their own arrogance had sealed them off from reality entirely. They didn't notice the broad-shouldered men stationed near the service exit's earpieces in place. They didn't see the federal agents holding in the shadows. I checked the gold pocket watch Irene had given me on our 20th anniversary. The time for observation was finished. The mandatory shareholder disclosure meeting I had quietly compelled the legal department to schedule was set to begin in exactly 3 minutes. I turned from the balcony and moved down the sweeping carpeted staircase toward the main foyer. With each step, the weight of the past week lifted from my frame. The midnight blue suit sat across my shoulders with a precise, commanding heaviness demanding attention and projecting an authority that needed no introduction. The transformation was stark. The pathetic, uneducated father-in-law they had ridiculed in a hardware store no longer existed. In his place stood the architect, the absolute majority shareholder of Crestline Logistics, come to reclaim what was his. I reached the bottom of the staircase and set foot on the marble floor of the grand foyer. 2 massive doors of dark wood stood between me and the ballroom. I did not break stride. I did not wait to be announced. I placed both palms flat against the polished surface and drove the doors open with a single resonant crack. The impact of wood striking wall cut straight through the ambient hum of the gala. The jazz trio stumbled. A note dropped, a beat lost, as the musicians turned toward the entrance. A wave of silence moved outward from the back of the room and rolled steadily toward the center. Hundreds of faces swiveled to find out who had the audacity to interrupt the carefully managed flow of the evening. I stepped into the full light of the ballroom. There was nothing shuffling or apologetic in how I moved. Long, deliberate strides, posture straight, gaze fixed directly ahead. The midnight blue absorbed the light around me, making me look like a dark, immovable column cutting through a sea of color. The younger executives and the politicians looked merely puzzled, unable to place the imposing figure crossing the floor. But the senior board members, the men and women who had been with Crestline Logistics since the earliest days, knew me the instant they saw me. I watched the color leave the face of our chief financial officer. The lead legal counsel took a sharp step backward and put a champagne glass on the carpet without meaning to. The whispers ignited and ran through the room like a current. The board was terrified. The ghost had come back. The wave of stricken silence finally reached the center of the ballroom. Derek stopped mid-sentence. He turned an irritated scowl already forming, annoyed that his audience had shifted its attention elsewhere. Then his eyes found me moving at a steady, unhurried pace across the floor toward him. For a fraction of a second, his mind failed to reconcile what it was seeing. He recognized the face of the man he had berated in a small kitchen, but the bearing, the clothing, the atmosphere of absolute authority radiating off this figure did not match the version of me he had filed away. Clifford and Lorraine stopped their procession. Lorraine's hand flew to the diamond necklace at her throat, jaw falling open in naked disbelief. The smug confidence drained from Clifford's face and left behind something that looked very much like paralysis. They had barred me from attending. They had promised the security team would haul me out onto the street. Yet here I was, moving through the heart of their kingdom, with an authority that made the air around me feel different, and not a single guard moved to intercept me. I did not stop. I kept my eyes fixed on Derek, walking in a straight line toward the main stage, the heavy leather folder in my hand containing the end of his world. The music in the grand ballroom seemed to recede into a low, distant vibration as I crossed the polished marble floor. The crowd of politicians, bank executives, and corporate leaders drew back instinctively, parting before me as though the air itself had changed pressure. They had no idea who I was, but they felt the authority radiating off the midnight blue suit without needing to be told. Clifford and Lorraine were stationed near a towering, glittering ice sculpture, crystal flutes of imported champagne in hand. Lorraine saw me first. I watched the color evacuate her heavily powdered face in an instant. Her hand shook so badly that a splash of golden liquid ran down the front of her expensive silk gown. She seized Clifford by the arm, her perfectly manicured nails sinking into the fabric of his sleeve. Clifford turned to follow her terrified gaze. The mild, wealthy annoyance his face had been wearing a moment before dissolved into a mask of naked, furious rage. They abandoned their conversation with a prominent local politician on the spot and came at me with purpose. There was a frantic, aggressive charge in how they moved the energy of people who can feel their carefully constructed illusion teetering toward collapse. Clifford planted himself in my path, stepping close enough that I caught the sharp bite of alcohol on his breath. He swept his eyes over me, practically bulging with hatred. He didn't register the immaculate tailoring or the quality of the Italian wool. All he could see was the man he had ridiculed in a hardware store, the man he had decided in his bones belonged in the dirt. He dropped his voice to a vicious hiss, demanding to know how a pathetic beggar had gotten through the front doors. He accused me of slipping in through the service entrance like a rat hunting for scraps. Lorraine moved up tight beside him, face flushed and venomous. She hissed that I was a humiliation to her family and to every decent person in that room. She told me I was deliberately trying to destroy the most important evening of her son's life. She ordered me to turn around, walk out, and drag myself back to my miserable suburban house before she had me removed by force. I did not blink. I said nothing at all in return. I stood completely still, both hands resting lightly on the dark leather folder at my side. I looked straight through them as though they weren't there, which in any meaningful sense they weren't. The disturbance had not gone unnoticed across the room. Near the main stage, Derek had gone completely rigid. He was surrounded by the full executive board of directors, the very men and women whose confidence he needed to cement his takeover. I watched him register the commotion. I watched his eyes find my face. The sheer blinding panic that swept over him was a magnificent thing to witness. That practiced, arrogant smile of his fell apart entirely. He excused himself from the circle of senior executives with a jerk of his neck, the skin there flushing a deep, furious crimson. He came across the ballroom floor with heavy, aggressive strides, his polished leather shoes striking the marble in hard, deliberate beats. He was sweating visibly under the chandelier light, the untouchable king of Crestline Logistics rattled to his core by a single old man standing quietly in the center of his own ballroom. Derek shouldered past a cluster of startled investors and drove himself between Clifford and me. His voice dropped into a trembling, vicious growl. He demanded to know if I had lost my mind entirely. He reminded me in sharp and clipped tones of the legal documents I had signed in my living room just 24 hours ago. He told me I had signed away every right, every claim to his family and to his company. He wanted to know why I was bent on making a spectacle of him in front of the powerful people who held his future in their hands. He threatened to annihilate my relationship with Natalie. He promised to ensure I ended my days completely alone, severed from my only daughter and from any grandchildren I might ever have known. He was vibrating with rage, pouring every ounce of his guilt and fear and monumental arrogance directly onto me. He genuinely believed he still commanded the room. He was certain he could bully me back into silence the same way he always had. I let his threats hang in the cold charge air between us, without catching them. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice or match the frantic, sweating energy he was radiating. I stood there, a solid, unmovable column of midnight blue wool, holding the physical proof of his coming federal indictment. I watched the sweat bead on his forehead. I noticed how his hand shook as he jabbed a finger toward my chest. He was coming apart in front of me right there under the chandelier. He couldn't understand why the threats weren't landing. He couldn't grasp why the uneducated father-in-law wasn't folding. My silence enraged him far more than any shouted reply could have. It pushed him right to the edge of coherent thought. When words failed him, Derek's eyes swept frantically across the room, searching for a way to reassert control over the scene. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers hard in the air, throwing a sharp signal across the ballroom. He caught the eye of the head of corporate security, a broad, heavily built professional stationed near the main entrance. Derek leveled the finger directly at me. He ordered the man to remove me from the premises immediately and physically. He was done, keeping his voice low. He wanted the surrounding guests to watch him exercise his authority. He declared loudly that I was a deranged trespasser who had been harassing his family for months. He told the security team to drag me out to the pavement and to call the city police once they had done it. He announced that he was filing full criminal charges, trespassing, harassment, everything available to him. He wanted the entire board of directors to witness him crushing a threat in real time. Clifford and Lorraine stood behind him, with their arms crossed, twin expressions of smug, malicious anticipation on their faces. They were ready to enjoy every moment of my public removal. The head of security started moving. He was a seasoned professional, a man I had personally approved for hire more than a decade ago to oversee security at the Crestline Logistics corporate headquarters. His face was a trained blank as he crossed the floor. Two other large guards came with him, moving in the tight formation. The crowd peeled back on both sides, clearing a lane for the extraction. Derek turned a sneer on me and murmured that my little rebellion was finished. He told me I would be spending the remainder of the evening in a concrete holding cell. I kept my breathing slow and level, not one step back, both hands steady on the dark leather folder. The head of security arrived at our group and brought his heavy hand up toward my shoulder, prepared to steer me physically toward the exit. Derek stepped back with a satisfied air, clearing space for what came next, but the hand never made contact with my suit. Before the security chief could complete the motion, a tall, composed figure stepped out from the shadows beside the nearest mezzanine pillar. Franklin, my chief legal counsel, moved with the quiet, predatory certainty of a man who already knew every move on the board. No shouting, no urgency in his stride. He simply walked into the center of the confrontation and took his place directly beside me. The head of security stopped where he stood. His raised hand froze in the air. The veteran recognized Franklin immediately. Every senior member of the Crestline Logistics Security Division knew that Franklin was the sole earthly representative of the anonymous founder's blind trust. He was the highest legal authority in the entire corporate structure, above the chief executive officer in every meaningful way. The security chief's eyes moved from Franklin to me, standing calmly at Franklin's side in the bespoke suit, the executive portfolio in hand. The realization hit him like a wave. He understood in an instant the full weight of the situation and exactly where the true chain of command ran. The man lowered his hand immediately. He took one deliberate step backward, squared his shoulders, and dipped his head in a respectful acknowledgement directed at me. He did not look at Derek. He did not acknowledge Clifford or Lorraine. The authority in the room had just shifted like a fault line giving way, and Derek was left standing fully exposed in the rubble of his own collapsed reality. Franklin didn't wait for the security detail to finish retreating. He turned toward the grand stage at the far end of the ballroom and walked with quiet purpose. His footsteps made no sound on the carpet, Yet the crowd yielded before him all the same. They recognized the chief legal counsel of the blind trust. His presence told them something of the highest corporate magnitude was about to occur. The jazz trio continued playing a soft, seamless melody from their corner of the room, entirely unaware of the tectonic shift that had just taken place on the floor below. Franklin mounted the 3 short steps to the stage. He moved toward the sleek silver microphone standing at center stage. He reached out and struck the metal mesh twice with his index finger. The sharp, amplified crack rang out like a gunshot across the vast room. The musicians startled in their seats. The cellist dragged his bow harshly across the strings, producing a discordant screech before the music died altogether. The silence that followed was total and suffocating. Hundreds of conversations cut off in the same instant. The chime of crystal and the low murmur of high society networking vanished, replaced by a thick, pressing anticipation. Every eye in the grand ballroom locked onto Franklin. He adjusted the microphone and surveyed the sea of wealthy investors, politicians, and corporate executives spread out before him. He did not smile. His voice was a calm, resonant baritone, carrying the unmistakable authority of federal law. He formally announced that he was calling an emergency mandatory shareholder disclosure meeting to order. A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. Gala dinners existed for toasting glasses and celebrating corporate mergers, not for invoking emergency corporate bylaws. Several board members began trading nervous glances. They understood the legal language Franklin was deploying. They knew a mandatory shareholder meeting could only be called under conditions of severe financial peril or executive misconduct. Franklin pressed on without a single pause. He stated that under the specific provisions of the corporate charter, the absolute majority shareholder held the unilateral right to freeze all executive actions and address the board of directors at any time. He announced that for the first time in a decade, the anonymous founder of Crestline Logistics had chosen to step out of the shadows. The founder had watched the internal rot spreading through his company and had come personally to correct its course. The founder was standing in this very room at this very moment. Derek let out a loud theatrical scoff that rang clearly through the hushed space. He straightened his expensive silk tie and pushed out his chest. He was entirely blind to the reality closing in around him. He genuinely took this for a dramatic corporate flourish, a surprise introduction staged by the elusive billionaire to publicly bless the upcoming merger and validate his leadership. Derek scanned the room eagerly, his gaze sweeping the crowd of older wealthy men in custom tuxedos, hunting for a face he could charm. He readied his most winning magnetic smile. He assumed he was moments away from shaking hands with a legendary business titan and welcoming him to the stage as a peer. He expected the founder to clap him on the back and praise his sharp mind in front of the entire city. He was already composing the press release in his head. His vanity had blinded him completely to the cold truth standing just a few yards away. Franklin did not scan the room. He kept his gaze perfectly level. He raised his right hand and pointed a single steady finger directly at me. The crowd turned as one following the invisible line from the stage to where I stood in my midnight blue suit. The weight of 1,000 eyes landed on me all at once. I did not hurry. I tightened my grip on the heavy leather folder holding the forensic audit. I began walking toward the stage. The crowd parted ahead of me, like water opening a wide path. Every step I took was measured and deliberate. I was no longer the weathered man buying soil at the hardware store. I was no longer the quiet, agreeable father-in-law they could safely dismiss and abuse. I was the architect of the very floor beneath their feet. I walked past the stricken faces of the senior vice presidents who already felt the shift in power. I walked past the federal agents positioned near the exits, waiting in silence for me to speak the words that would authorize their arrest warrants. I reached the wooden steps leading up to the platform and climbed them. The solid thud of my polished shoes against the wood carried through the silent room. I stepped onto the stage and took my place beside Franklin. I looked out over the crowd. Derek stood in the front row less than 10 FT away. The arrogant smile had vanished entirely from his face. The healthy color drained from his skin in an instant, leaving him the shade of dirty ash. His mouth fell open slightly, but no sound came out. He stared up at me, eyes wide with a pure, undisguised terror he could not contain. His mind was violently rejecting what it saw. The man who held absolute power over his entire existence was the same man he had mocked, robbed, and tried to throw into the street just moments before. In that agonizing second, he understood that his career, his wealth, and his freedom were entirely in my hands. He looked at the thick leather folder I carried and grasped that his perfect crime had been fully exposed. A few feet away, Derek, Clifford, and Lorraine stood frozen in a state of complete shock. Lorraine had gone completely rigid. Her hand still clutched her stolen diamond necklace knuckles, turning bone white. She took in my bespoke suit and the undeniable authority I commanded on that stage. The sickening realization that she had spent 30 minutes publicly insulting the billionaire founder of the company crashed over her like a physical blow. Clifford looked like he might be violently ill. He swayed slightly on his expensive Italian loafers. The smug, predatory sneer he had worn all evening was gone, replaced by the wide-trapped stare of a cornered animal. They had spent years constructing a false dynasty on the foundation of my quiet labor. They had decided I was weak simply because I was kind. They had mistaken my preference for a simple private life as a deficiency of intelligence or ambition. Now, the very bedrock of their stolen empire was dissolving beneath them. The millions they had siphoned, the luxury cars they drove, the lavish vacations they flaunted, all of it was about to be cataloged as federal evidence. The silence in the ballroom stretched on taut and heavy with impending ruin. I stood at the center of the stage, looking out over the empire I had built from nothing. I opened the heavy leather folder, stepped up to the sleek microphone, and prepared to dismantle their world completely. I looked out over the sea of terrified faces from behind the polished acrylic podium. The quiet in the grand ballroom was so complete I could hear the faint hum of the stage lights above me. I did not raise my voice. I had no need to shout. True power does not demand volume. It demands absolute, unshakable certainty. I leaned into the silver microphone and let my voice carry through the vast space with precise, terrifying corporate authority. I welcomed the board of directors, the shareholders, and the distinguished guests to this mandatory emergency disclosure meeting. I told them that for the past decade I had entrusted the daily operations of Crestline Logistics to a new generation of leadership. I had believed in their vision and their integrity, but trust without verification is nothing more than foolishness, and my verification had uncovered a staggering depth of betrayal. I raised my right hand and gave a sharp, brief nod to the audiovisual technicians in the glass booth at the rear of the room. Franklin had secured their full cooperation hours earlier. The massive high-definition screens behind me had been displaying the glowing logo of the new corporate merger. In a fraction of a second, those screens went black. Then they lit up with something far more revealing. Enormous images of offshore bank statements, corporate ledgers, and shell company registries flooded the displays. The harsh white light of the financial documents illuminated the stunned faces of the elite crowd. I began to speak methodically, walking the board of directors through every step of the fraud. I detailed the fictitious vendors Derek had created to funnel cash out of our hardware division. I showed the audience precisely how he had manipulated the quarterly earnings reports to conceal the financial hemorrhage. I directed their attention to specific wire transfer logs, citing the exact dates and exact amounts that had been routed into untraceable accounts. The audience stared at the screens in absolute horror. These were bankers, politicians, and seasoned investors. They knew precisely what they were looking at. They were staring at a textbook embezzlement scheme executed at the highest level of leadership. I did not let them look away. I narrated the movement of the stolen money, tracing it from the corporate treasury, through a labyrinth of shell corporations, and into the personal private accounts of the man standing in the front row. I watched the senior vice presidents physically pull back from Derek as though his corruption were a contagious disease. The murmurs of disbelief began spreading through the room, growing louder with every new piece of evidence I laid before them. The assembled elite were coming to understand that the man they had been celebrating was nothing more than a highly skilled parasite. The corporate fraud, however, was only half of what I had prepared. His family's breathtaking sense of entitlement demanded its own separate reckoning. My finger found the button on the podium. The screens changed. What appeared this time was an official ownership deed for an 80-default luxury yacht, rendered in precise legal detail. The purchase price had a bright red circle drawn around it. Beside it on the screen sat a wire transfer originating from a Crestline Logistics Phantom account, the figures identical to the last cent. My eyes found Clifford and Lorraine, where they stood rigid among the crowd. I leaned into the microphone and made sure every syllable landed. I told the entire ballroom that the dazzling life this family projected to the world was a hollow fiction bankrolled from beginning to end, with money they had stolen from my company. The suits on their backs, the jewels at their throats, the champagne in their hands, every bit of it purchased with funds that belonged to me. Clifford went white as bleached bone. He pressed himself backward, hunting for cover in the crowd, desperate to escape the glare pouring off those screens. Lorraine made a strangled, breathless sound and clamped both hands over her mouth. The diamond necklace at her collar suddenly looked less like an ornament and more like a noose. The people surrounding them drew back as one, leaving Clifford and Lorraine marooned in an open ring of social exile. The same guests who had clinked glasses with them minutes before now regarded those glasses as if something rancid had been poured inside. Politicians and socialites who had been heaping praise on this couple just 10 minutes prior now stared with open, unguarded contempt. I had torn the gilded mask off their manufactured dynasty and done it in front of exactly the audience they had spent their lives performing for. These were not captains of industry. They were petty swindlers in expensive costumes, and the wealth they wore belonged to me. The sound that rolled through that crowd, a collective intake of breath, a wave of murmured disbelief, was the most satisfying music I had ever heard. Derek broke first. The full weight of his public annihilation came down on him all at once, and something inside him simply gave way. He screamed raw and ragged and threw himself at the stage steps. He clambered up awkwardly, his immaculate tuxedo straining across his back as sweat soaked through it. Panic had taken over every feature of his face. He lunged toward me with shaking hands, grabbing for the microphone, trying to silence what could no longer be silenced. He shrieked that every document on those screens was a forgery, that a coordinated conspiracy had been assembled specifically to destroy him. He implored the board not to give my words a moment's credence. He had the desperate, hollow sound of a child whose lie had finally irrevocably caught up with him. The poised executive he had spent years constructing was dissolving in real time, right in front of the people whose respect he had coveted most. Franklin moved to step in, but I lifted one hand and held him back. A shattered man posed no threat to me. I planted my feet and stayed exactly where I was, steady and unmoved, while Derek grasped uselessly at the space between us. The tears came then, hot and uncontrolled, cutting channels through his polished presentation. He rambled. He could make it right. He could put every dollar back. He only needed one more opportunity to lay out the full picture of what had happened with the finances. Every desperate syllable poured out through the open microphone for the entire room to absorb. He swore he would resign on the spot tonight without a scene if I would only go dark on those screens and let him leave. I held his gaze and did not look away. Everything else in the room receded. The noise, the crowd, the occasion, all of it fell away. What remained was just the two of us. I felt nothing resembling mercy. I drew close to the microphone so my voice would travel to the furthest corner of that hall and beyond. I told him his explanations had no value. I told him his promises meant nothing. I told him his time as masters of this particular universe had come to a permanent end. The voice that delivered the sentence was quiet, flat, and without warmth. I told Derek that as of this moment, he was terminated from Crestline Logistics. His title was gone. His authority was gone. His access was gone. I told him he was a small-time thief who had been wearing a borrowed suit, and he would never again cross the threshold of my building. Those words settled over the room like a stone dropped into still water. The public execution was complete. Derek's legs went out from under him on that stage, and he went down onto his knees, face buried in his hands, the full reality of his annihilation finally caving in on him. A crumpled, heaving figure in expensive wool that was all that remained of his empire. The declaration of his termination still echoed somewhere in the vaulted silence of the ballroom. Around the room, the politicians and power brokers had not moved a muscle. Every one of them was holding their breath, waiting for the next thing to fall. I looked down at the man who had tried to hollow out my life and ruin my daughter. Quiet sobs shook his shoulders. Not a trace of his manufactured confidence survived, but dismissing him from his position was a procedural matter, a formality of corporate governance. What he had actually done to me, to my family, to the company, I had bled to build. That required a penalty that reached well outside the walls of Crestline Logistics. I drew my gaze slowly away from Derek and lifted it toward the far end of the room. I raised my right hand, one clean, unhurried gesture. The signal Franklin and I had rehearsed with care the night before. The tall entrance doors at the rear of the ballroom burst open. They struck the walls with a concussive bang that sent several guests stumbling sideways in shock. 12 federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division entered in formation. Dark tactical gear, heavy vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Whatever pretense of glamour the evening still held, shattered on impact. They advanced in lockstep, precise and relentless. Each boot strike on the marble floor sent a hard-measured echo rolling through the room. The crowd dissolved ahead of them. Custom tuxedos and designer gowns scattered in every direction. Nobody wanted to occupy the same airspace as a federal operation in progress. The lead agent set a straight course for the stage. No hesitation, no deviation. He took the steps up in several long, heavy strides, 2 agents positioned tight on either side. Derek's swollen, tear-tracked face came up just in time to register what was bearing down on him. He scuttled backward, instinctive animal, and began pouring out a torrent of disconnected pleas. He begged for a pause. He swore that given the chance to stand before a judge, he could account for everything. The lead agent paid his pleading no attention whatsoever. He took Derek by the shoulder of that expensive jacket and lifted him to standing. He locked Derek's arms behind him with practiced force. The snap of the steel handcuffs closing around Derek's wrists rang out like a small explosion through the microphone still live beside me. 10 years of waiting, and that sound was worth every one of them. Derek let out a high-pitched wail of despair as the cold metal closed on his skin. The man who had considered himself untouchable was now a federal prisoner, weeping in front of the world he had tried to own. On the ballroom floor below the scene in front of him, finally punched through the wall of Clifford's arrogance and registered. His son in handcuffs, the full machinery of a federal raid grinding forward around him. Every cowardly reflex the man had spent a lifetime cultivating took command in that instant. He made no move toward his son. He didn't spare a glance for his wife. Clifford wheeled on the heel of his pristine tan loafer and ran. He drove his shoulder into a prominent city alderman to clear the path and sprinted hard for the side exit near the catering corridor. The sight of him fleeing in his ivory merino sweater draped over his shoulders was genuinely absurd. He imagined he could dissolve into the night and leave the wreckage of his choices to someone else. But Franklin had mapped out every possible exit from this scenario long before tonight. A pair of federal agents had been stationed at that precise door for more than an hour waiting in the dark. The moment Clifford hit the brass door handle with his full weight, they materialized. The intercept was swift and without ceremony. One agent seized Clifford by the sweater and drove him into the wall, pressing him flat against the decorative wallpaper. Clifford cried out sharp, high, terrified, as his arms were pulled back and the iron cuffs snapped shut. Across the room, Lorraine had not moved an inch from her spot beside the ice sculpture. She watched her husband folded against the wall. She watched her son held fast on the stage above. Her face beneath the heavy layer of powder had gone completely blank with horror. A female federal agent walked toward her, without hurrying her expression, carrying no warmth at all. The agent produced a substantial bundle of legal warrants from inside her jacket. She announced in a voice the entire room could hear that Clifford and Lorraine were formally under investigation for federal racketeering and the receipt of stolen corporate funds. She informed the silent ballroom that every account attached to their names had been locked and frozen effective immediately, and that their fleet of luxury vehicles, their offshore holdings, and the 80-FT yacht currently docked in Miami had all been seized by the federal government. The agent turned to Lorraine and issued a direct order. Surrender the diamond necklace she had around her throat. It had been acquired with embezzled funds and was now classified as active federal evidence. What came out of Lorraine was not a cry, it was something more primitive, a guttural sound torn from somewhere deep. The sound of a woman watching the entire scaffolding of her invented life collapse into cinders. Her legs gave way beneath her silk trench coat. She hit the polished floor hard, dissolving into hysterical sobs. The female agent did not flinch. She crouched and unclasped the heavy diamond necklace from Lorraine's neck in one efficient motion. The glittering jewels went into a clear plastic evidence bag with a flat, indifferent thud. Lorraine remained on her knees, gasping and weeping. She stretched her trembling hands toward the wealthy guests she had been performing for all evening. She pleaded for someone to intervene, begged anyone nearby to phone a lawyer, but the crowd only stared back at her with cold, undisguised contempt. The society she had schemed and clawed to enter was now regarding her the way you regard something diseased. The lead agent on the stage gave his team a single sharp nod. The procession began. Derek, Clifford, and Lorraine were marched toward the main entrance in a parade of total and absolute disgrace. Derek descended the stage steps with his head hanging, using the angle to shield his tear-streaked face from the board members who had watched him unravel. Clifford was guided by the collar of his ruined ivory merino sweater, the spotless tan loafers dragging and scuffing against the carpet as he mumbled incoherently, twisting away from the stairs, closing in on him from every direction. Lorraine was hauled upright and walked alongside them, mascara running in dark, jagged rivers down her face. The entire grand ballroom observed in complete silence as this counterfeit aristocratic family was escorted out into the cold night air. They departed that luxurious hotel in steel restraints, every scrap of their stolen wealth and manufactured dignity stripped from them. I stood at the podium and watched the tall entrance doors swing shut behind them. The cancer had been cut out entirely. Something in the very air of that room seemed to shift cleaner, lighter, easier to breathe. The federal agents had performed their work with exact and flawless precision, leaving no ambiguity, no opening for misreading what had just occurred. The long and brutal war I had been waging was finished. I swept my gaze across the silent gathering of executives and investors. They stared back with a complicated blend of awe and barely concealed fear. They grasped now viscerally, unmistakably, what it actually cost to betray the foundation of this company. I straightened the front of my midnight blue suit and readied myself to address the board of directors. The true founder of Crestline Logistics had fully reclaimed what had been taken from him. A new era was beginning, one built on absolute integrity and nothing less. The grand ballroom drained of people, leaving a silence that pressed against the walls. The terrified executives and socialites poured through the gilded exit doors, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the federal raid they had just witnessed firsthand. The jazz trio had packed away their instruments and slipped quietly into the night. Catering staff moved through the space like pale ghosts, collecting half-drained crystal champagne flutes and untouched silver platters of caviar. The room that had projected such invincible arrogance barely an hour before now felt hollow and emptied out like a stage after the final curtain. I stood near the edge of the platform and drew a long, slow breath. The weight of the midnight blue wool on my shoulders felt somehow less than it had before. The corporate execution was behind me, and the federal authorities were processing the prisoners. But there was one more thing I needed to do, the thing that mattered most of all. I stepped away from the empty podium and looked out across the expanse of polished marble. I found her near the walnut doors at the far end of the room. Natalie looked impossibly small in that cavernous space. She wore a simple dark dress that stood in quiet contrast to the extravagant gowns that had swept through the room all evening. Both hands gripped the edge of a velvet-draped cocktail table, knuckles bloodless. Even at that distance, I could see the trembling in her shoulders. She had taken in the entire spectacle from the margins, from the shadows where no one was watching her. She had seen her husband's false empire reduced to rubble. She had learned the truth about her father's real identity. In the space of 30 minutes, the bedrock of her entire understanding of her life had been cracked open and rearranged. I descended from the stage and crossed the ballroom floor toward her. My shoes made a soft, steady rhythm against the marble. As I drew near, Natalie slowly raised her face. Her eyes were wide, filled with a churning current of shock and confusion, and something that looked underneath it all like awe. She took in the tailored suit, the bearing, the authority that I no longer had any reason to conceal. All her life, she had known me as a quiet man, unpretentious. Someone who worked with his hands and who preferred the scent of cedar sawdust to expensive cologne. She had watched me absorb the relentless condescension of her husband and his parents year after year, and never once raised my voice. Now, she was looking at the absolute majority shareholder of a multinational corporation, the man who had just dismantled a fraudulent dynasty with a word. I stopped a few feet away. I did not say anything yet. I simply opened my arms. Natalie made a small, soft sound and closed the space between us. She came into my chest and buried her face in the dark wool of my jacket. I pulled her close, holding her with the same fierce and protective grip I used when she was small and woke frightened in the night. I felt the shaking in her body slowly ease as she leaned into me. The cold formality of the hotel ballroom fell away until there was nothing left but a father and his daughter. Natalie curled her fingers into the lapels of my jacket, her tears soaking into the fabric. She leaned back a little and searched my face. She said she finally understood. She whispered that all the pieces she had never been able to fit together had suddenly violently locked into place. She saw clearly now the depth of the deception Derek had constructed around her, how his initial romantic pursuit had been calculated from the start, how the rushed proposal and the systematic effort to cut her off from everyone else were never spontaneous. Every step had been deliberate. He had never loved her. He had loved what he believed she stood to inherit, the proximity to a fortune he intended to take. Natalie said this aloud, with a voice that shook, but her eyes were steady. The poisonous illusion of her marriage was gone for good. I kept my hands resting on her shoulders, solid and still holding her in place. I owed her an explanation, a real one, for the long deception I had chosen to maintain. I spoke quietly, making sure every word carried the full weight of what I meant. Building a company of that magnitude, I told her, draws a very particular kind of predator. People who weigh every human being by their net worth and their access to capital. After her mother died, and I was raising her on my own, I made a vow. I would keep her shielded from that artificial, corrupting world. I stepped back from the public role and kept the wealth invisible because I wanted her to grow up with both feet on solid ground, to know the value of honest labor, of real connection, of being seen for who she actually was, rather than what she might one day be worth. I needed her to move through the world without that shadow falling across every relationship she formed. True wealth, I told her, cannot be worn around your neck or docked in a harbor. It is not poured into a crystal flute or anchored offshore. It lives in character. It lives in how a person conducts themselves when no one is watching. I had wanted her life built on that foundation, but in trying to protect her from the darkness of that world, I had left a gap. I had left her exposed. I lowered my head and I apologized fully, sincerely, with all the weight I felt. I told her I was sorry for allowing someone like Derek to find his way into our lives. I was sorry for the manipulation he had visited on her, for the tears she had shed at our kitchen table just a few nights before. My single-minded focus on maintaining the appearance of a simple life had led a predator through the door. I told her that was the greatest failure of my life as her father, and it was one I would carry. I brought my thumb gently to her cheek and wiped away a tear that had broken loose. Then I looked at her directly and I gave her my word. I told her she was free, completely and permanently free. The legal snare had been closed. The federal authorities had removed every threat. Derek and his corrupt family would spend the remainder of their lives beneath the crushing weight of what their greed had brought down on them. They would never reach her again. She was safe, and everything ahead of her belonged entirely to her. Natalie looked at me, and something in her face shifted profoundly, visibly. The lingering fear and betrayal that had lived in her eyes for months lifted and dissolved. She exhaled a long, unsteady breath, and the tears came again. But these were nothing like the ones she had shed before. These were tears of pure, overwhelming relief, the kind that only arrives when a crushing weight is finally lifted for good. The suffocating bonds of a fraudulent marriage had been broken apart. She pressed her head against my chest and held on. The two of us stood together in the quiet hollow of the grand ballroom, the fading echoes of a destroyed empire all around us. The storm had run its course, and the air was finally clear. I held my daughter and knew with everything in me that we had survived the absolute worst they were capable of throwing at us, and we had come through it whole. 6 months finished what the evening had started. The federal justice system moves with a slow, grinding certainty that humbles even the most arrogant men. Derek never went through a long, dramatic trial. His expensive defense attorneys surveyed the mountain of forensic evidence Franklin had assembled and told him plainly surrender. Derek accepted a federal plea deal covering wire fraud, embezzlement, and corporate racketeering. The judge extended no mercy to a man who had weaponized corporate trust to steal millions. He was sentenced to 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The fall from a penthouse suite to a concrete cell shattered whatever remained of him. He exchanged his bespoke Italian wool suits for a standard-issue bright orange jumpsuit. The man who had once commanded boardrooms with a gesture now needed permission to use the telephone. His days are carved up by the harsh buzzing of prison alarms and the heavy metallic slam of iron doors. He sleeps on a thin mattress in a cell filled with deafening noise and relentless isolation. Every waking hour he sits with the knowledge that his own bottomless greed was the architect of the cage that now holds him. Derek's conviction was the blow that brought Clifford and Lorraine's brittle aristocratic facade down entirely. The federal authorities had no intention of stopping at Derek. They followed the money trail straight to his parents. The 80-foot luxury yacht moored in Miami was seized by federal marshals and auctioned off to repay the blind trust. Their fleet of imported luxury cars was towed from the driveway in the dead of night. The bank accounts that had funded their extravagant existence were frozen solid and emptied by the government. The millions they had treated as their rightful inheritance evaporated completely, leaving them with nothing at all. Federal racketeering statutes allowed the government to strip away every asset connected to the embezzled funds. Clifford and Lorraine stood by in helpless horror as agents boxed up the expensive artwork, the designer clothing, and the stolen jewelry. The empire they believed Derek's scheming had secured for them disappeared, exposing them to a harsh reality they had never once prepared for. Losing the stolen money was devastating. But for Lorraine, the social execution cut far deeper. Elite society runs on a ruthless and unforgiving set of rules. The moment news of the federal indictment broke in the morning, papers Clifford and Lorraine were cast out immediately and permanently. Their country club memberships were revoked without ceremony. The charity gala invitations and exclusive dinner notices simply stopped coming. Lorraine reached out to her wealthy circle desperate for a sympathetic ear or even a short-term loan. Every call went to voicemail. The women who had clinked champagne glasses with her now crossed to the opposite side of the street rather than meet her eyes. Clifford found himself equally shut out. The businessmen and politicians he had golfed with for years suddenly had no memory of his name. The rarefied world they had spent so long trying to penetrate ejected them the way a body rejects a foreign object. They had never built real friendships because everything they had built rested on lies and money that wasn't theirs. Strip away the illusion of wealth, and they became invisible. With their assets confiscated and their accounts drained, Clifford and Lorraine were driven out of their sprawling suburban home. They had no savings to draw on, and no practical skills capable of generating income. They were reduced to the exact circumstances they had spent their entire lives sneering at. They found a cramped, unheated one-bedroom apartment on the far edge of the city. The building was old and sagging, hemmed in by cracked pavement and rusted chain-link fencing. No polished marble in the lobby, no valet, no security, no concierge. The kitchen had peeling linoleum floors and a refrigerator that rattled and shuddered through the night. Lorraine could no longer spend her afternoons drifting through high-end boutiques. She was reduced to clipping paper coupons and calculating the cost difference between generic brands. She learned to ride the public bus because a vehicle was out of reach. The designer satin dresses she had treasured gave way to cheap practical clothes chosen for warmth in a drafty apartment. The gap between what her life had been and what it now was, that contrast was a daily grinding punishment she could not escape. Clifford struggled to make sense of the existence now surrounding him. He had spent his adult life performing the role of a business titan without ever once doing the underlying work. Now poverty made real demands he had no capacity to meet. Unpaid utility bills accumulated on the small scratch dining table. With Derek locked away in federal prison, there was no one left to steal on their behalf. Clifford was forced to swallow his pride and look for work. At 60 years old, with a demolished reputation and no verifiable skills to speak of, the options available to him were brutal in their narrowness. The man who had looked down at service workers from the deck of a stolen yacht now submitted applications for entry-level retail positions. Store managers glanced at his empty resume and moved on. The irony was absolute and without mercy. He passed his days sitting in the cold, drafty apartment, staring at the peeling paint on the walls. A constant gnawing dread of eviction had replaced the arrogant confidence he used to wear like a second skin. He had built his entire sense of self around being above the working class. And now he was drowning in the very hardships he had once found so easy to mock. The physical misery of that life was considerable. The psychological torment was worse. The cramped walls of that cheap apartment threw Clifford and Lorraine together every minute of every day. There was no sprawling estate to retreat into. No expensive wine to dull the edges of reality. The resentment fermenting between them boiled over into bitter, relentless arguments. Clifford blamed Lorraine for pushing Derek to steal more to fund her appetite for luxury. Lorraine screamed back that Clifford had always been a weak, pathetic man who could not provide for his own family without hiding behind criminal behavior. They became each other's worst enemies, locked together in a prison of their own design. The slow escalation of hostility between them consumed whatever scraps remained of their marriage. Nothing left between them but blame and contempt. Their son was gone. Their stolen fortune was gone. Their manufactured friendships were gone. They were marooned together on the freezing outskirts of the city, with nothing left to do but tear each other apart. In that tiny, unheated apartment, they absorbed the hardest lesson of their lives. Real wealth is built on honest labor and genuine integrity. A structure raised on deception and stolen money will always eventually come down. They had spent years looking down on quiet, decent men. They had mistaken kindness for weakness and patience for stupidity. They had believed they could maneuver their way into a permanent dynasty. The total ruin they now inhabited was the direct and precise result of their own greed compounded across years with no correction. There was no redemption waiting for them. There was no hidden account left to rescue them from the consequences. The justice they received was complete and without expiration. The poverty they woke to every morning held up a perfect mirror, and what it reflected back was the absolute emptiness at the center of everything they had ever been. They would spend the rest of their days paying that price. The early air was crisp and perfectly still. I sat on the worn wooden steps of my front porch, a dented tin mug wrapped in both hands. The boards beneath me were old and weathered, marked by decades of turning seasons and the countless times my boots had scraped across their surface. I lifted the mug and took a slow sip of the dark, bitter liquid. Cheap store-bought coffee brewed strong, exactly the way I had taken it for the past 40 years. I watched the first pale light of dawn pull itself up over the horizon, washing the quiet suburban street in soft tones of blue and gray. The neighborhood was beginning to stir. Across the street, Mrs. Gable was walking her golden retriever in her thick wool coat. The newspaper delivery truck rounded the corner, tires rolling soft and easy over the damp asphalt. An ordinary morning in an ordinary neighborhood. Anyone glancing at me on this weathered porch in my faded corduroy jacket would never guess at the scale of what I controlled. That was precisely the point, and I had no intention of changing it. The screen door gave its soft, familiar squeak behind me. Natalie stepped out onto the porch. She had an oversized knitted sweater pulled around her and a steaming mug of coffee in both hands. She didn't say a word. She came down the steps and settled in right beside me, drawing her knees up to her chest. I looked at my daughter. The dark circles that had shadowed her eyes for months were gone without a trace. The coiled, trembling tension that had gripped her shoulders all through her marriage to Derek had dissolved entirely. She looked rested. She looked like herself again. Most importantly, she looked like a woman who had finally found peace. We sat shoulder to shoulder in the cool morning air and watched the neighborhood ease itself awake. There was no need to fill the quiet with words. The silence between us carried no weight anymore, no buried secrets, no unspoken fears pressing against it from underneath. It was a warm and easy silence resting on a foundation of restored truth and trust. Natalie tilted her head against my shoulder. I brought my arm around her and pulled her in. Over the 6 months just past, she had moved back into her childhood bedroom. We had logged countless hours at the old kitchen table, talking through the damage and slowly rebuilding the bond Derek had worked so hard to cut. She had asked me once not long after the trial, concluded why I had no desire to move. She'd looked at the bank statements by then. She understood I could buy any sprawling estate in the most exclusive address on earth outfit myself, with a fleet of luxury vehicles arranged for a private jet to sit idling whenever I chose. I gave her the same answer I had been giving myself for decades. A house is wood and glass and load-bearing walls. A home is something else entirely. It is made of memory. I built this place with my own hands. I carried her mother across this very threshold. Every summer, until Natalie left for college, I marked her height on the kitchen doorframe in pencil. No amount of money in any account anywhere could purchase that kind of history. Relocating to some hollow, cavernous mansion would not improve my life. It would only scrub away the real and grounded existence I had spent a lifetime building. The wealth I held was no longer something I had to keep hidden like a wound. It had returned to what it was always meant to be, a tool, nothing more. Back inside the glass towers of Crestline Logistics, the whole character of the place had changed. The poisonous culture of unchecked greed and ruthless maneuvering that Derek had spent years cultivating had been completely cleared out. Franklin and I had taken our time selecting a new executive board, measured people, honest, people leaders who cared about building something that would last, rather than extracting everything they could before the foundation cracked. The company was thriving again. The profits were no longer bleeding out through offshore shell accounts to subsidize the appetites of people who had no right to them. The returns were flowing back into the employees and into the company's future. I had no need to occupy the corner office to know that the enterprise was sound. Franklin managed the day-to-day legal architecture of the blind trust with his characteristic sharp efficiency. I remained the absolute majority shareholder, operating entirely out of view, steering from the background without ever needing to stand at the front of the room. The billions held inside those protected accounts were no longer a secret I carried alone, braced against discovery. They had become something different, a quiet and impenetrable barrier. I had put in place an ironclad legal structure designed to ensure Natalie would be shielded for the rest of her life. The money would never be allowed to define her. It would never again serve as bait for the kind of predator who treats another person's inheritance as a target. It would simply remain in the background, an invisible fortress absorbing whatever the world might eventually try to throw at her. She was working part-time at a local community center these days, finding real meaning in being useful to other people. She was learning who she was outside the reach of a controlling husband and beyond the harsh glare of high society. She was finding out in her own time and on her own terms that genuine value grows from the work you do with your hands and the care you extend to others, not from the label sewn inside a coat. The sun finally cleared the horizon. Gold and orange light broke across the suburban lawns, catching the dew on the grass and turning each drop into a tiny scattered diamond. A light breeze moved through the branches of the old oak at the edge of the yard. I lifted the dented tin mug and took another sip of that cheap, strong coffee. Something deep in my chest had settled thoroughly permanently. The war was a distant thing now, already receding. The vicious storm that had come so close to swallowing my family whole had been broken and scattered. The people who had engineered that storm were waking this morning to the hard metallic reality of the lives they had earned: prison cells and freezing apartments and the crushing weight of consequences that would follow them to the end. But here on this worn wooden porch there was only quiet and safety. Order had been permanently restored. The dignity of my family was whole. I looked out at the still street, then down at Natalie resting at my side. The greatest victory I understood then was not the dismantling of those who had tried to take everything from me. It was not the recovery of the company or the public reckoning in that ballroom. It was this: a calm morning, a cup of coffee, and the person I loved most in the world at peace beside me. The billionaire founder of Crestline Logistics was perfectly satisfied sitting on a peeling porch in a faded corduroy jacket, drinking from a dented tin mug. That morning on the porch with Natalie at my side and the sun coming up over a street that had seen all of it, the grief, the silence, the long, patient years of waiting, I understood something I could not have put into words while I was still in the middle of it. Patience is not the same as weakness. Silence is not the same as surrender. I believe God places certain people in your path, not to break you, but to reveal what you are made of. The cost of what I carried for those years was real. The loneliness of keeping the secret was real. But so was the morning it was finally over. If this story leaves you with anything, let it leave you with these: never confuse a quiet man for a powerless one. The deepest reservoirs do not make noise. When someone shows you contempt because of what they think you lack, let them. The accounting comes later. If you are caring for someone you love, a daughter, a parent, anyone, and it costs you your comfort and your pride, do not stop. That is the work that matters. And if you are somewhere in the middle of your own long wait, hold on. Every Adults 50+ listener who has written to me about a family revenge story that stretched across years has said the same thing the moment justice arrived. It arrived completely. If this story moved you, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that the quiet ones are often the most dangerous. And if you have not yet subscribed to Honor Revenge Stories, now is a good time. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will see you in the next one.